All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hey everyone, Happy New Year. My name is Hannah. This is the first webinar from Sustainability Solutions this year. Hope everyone is starting their 2025 off right. I know it's going to be a big year. I think it's a buckle up year, so I hope everyone's ready. But to start off this year, we're actually going to go back in time. And today I'm going to be covering some of the major buckets of sustainability legislation that were passed last year in the United States, both federally and at the state level. So before I introduce myself, I would like to invite you all to introduce yourselves in the chat. Feel free to put your name, your location, your job title, any other fun information you want to post, like your LinkedIn, what have you. Go ahead and do that now. So as I said, hi, my name is Hannah Nickerson. I'm the founder and lead consultant of Sustainability Solutions. I'm a fractional chief sustainability officer or targeted program manager for small and mid-sized businesses to advance more sustainable operations and stand out through that sustainable and responsible business practices. My background is mostly in operations, manufacturing, and the biotech industry. I had over 10 years experience with that. And for the past few years, I've been involved in consulting. My sustainability background started over 5 years ago now, implementing technical efficiency projects at a really big, complicated manufacturing plant. And now I'm still working with many different businesses and different industries to advance sustainability, and I love it. My educational background, I have a degree in industrial engineering. I also have certifications in Lean Six Sigma and sustainability. For example, I'm LEED, Green Associate and Project Manager certified. On the softer side of things, I do a lot of mentoring with women and also young professionals who are already in sustainability or looking to transition into the field. And I do volunteering as a consultant. I do volunteer tree planting. It's a little too cold out. It's about 10 degrees outside right now, so a little too cold for tree planting here in Maryland today. But also in the summertime, on every Saturday, I'm out at the local organic farm volunteering there, and that I just love. If you want to learn more about me or more about the business, you can visit sustainabilitysolutions.com. So the genesis of this webinar was actually for one of my clients. They're a sustainability software reporting platform. And so I was investigating different sustainability legislation for them. And I decided to round up the 2024 trends that I was seeing and present to you all because there's obvious compliance implications here. So before we get into some of the details, I just want to take a step back and talk about the history of sustainability legislation and why it's important. So our current economic system fails to factor in environmental sustainability and well-being. So as we all know, GDP is gross domestic product, or everything, products and services that's manufactured within a country's borders and or exported. Historically, increase in GDP or growing the economy went hand in hand with depleting our natural capital as well. So we're starting to shift away from that now, but really the economic system and GDP being the main measure undervalues nature and makes it too cheap to pollute. And we're starting to see the impacts of that economic checks and balances happening decades into this industrial revolution. So legislation is really the checks and balances on a free-for-all economy. It's nothing new. There have been a lot of great strides in protecting environmental, worker, and consumer rights in the past 100 years. So if we go back 100 years, it was really, if you think of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, right? That was really muckraking on the meatpacking industry. And so that was a turning point that spurred legislation really around worker and consumer rights. But 100 years ago, when it comes to environment, it's when we really started to think about parks, biodiversity within our cities, also cities versus wilderness, and also conservation of resources really started to, we started to think about that a little bit more. The next phase of environmental legislation was all about data collection and kind of the science of the environment and assessing our environmental impact, as well as passing wilderness protection legislation. So this is when we started to see national parks start popping up and really having areas of preservation. Into the 70s, this is when we think of maybe Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, right? So some of the effects of pollution and climate change were really starting to come to the forefront. There was rivers on fire and lots of air pollution, smog in our cities. And so the 70s is when we started doing pollution cleanup and control, as well as states started taking a more prioritized approach to their own natural resources. Then in the 80s into the 2000s, we really started to see the rise of this ESG kind of legislation. So some of the biggest companies in the world were starting to report on environmental, social, and governance metrics as well. So it's not just about how much profit you're making, but how are you protecting workers, the environment, and also like responsible supply chain. We started to think more about that as well. Here we are today. ESG in many ways is it's a hot topic. Some say we're moving away from ESG. We're moving more towards sustainability reporting. We're really seeing global legislation come in where it's not just country by country, but really a significant portion of the global economy is now required to do some of this sustainability reporting and legislation. And I also think urban ecological planning, like, greening our cities and green space within cities and access to nature. I think this is another hot topic that we're seeing for this year. So there's been a lot of different eras, and we're even entering in a new one now with the next administration coming in. Yet we look at the science and we look at the atmospheric carbon concentration and we look at the effects of pollution. They're really acts of diminishing returns, right? You can only grow the economy so much before those things really start negatively impacting more than they're positively impacting. So we're striking that balance, and there's a lot more opportunity when it comes to regulating responsible environmental protection and use of natural resources. So what were some of the biggest trends that we saw last year? So the three things I'm going to cover today are sustainability disclosure standards, extended producer responsibility, and also PFAS. So these legislation pieces are most applicable to businesses, especially those in supply chains. So if you manufacture services and products, if you're at a high enough level, you're required to do certain things. I think for the audience listening to this webinar, if anything, you're going to be getting requests from your customers on your sustainability performance. You may not be quite required to yet, but we'll get there. Producers and importers of certain goods, as well as local waste management organizations. And lastly, anyone who drinks or uses water. This legislation, you might want to see how it could impact you. All right, so first, sustainability legislation disclosures. Well, disclosure is what it sounds like. This legislation requires companies to disclose information about their sustainability-related risks and opportunities. So basically, this is greenhouse gas reporting. So right now, we're just starting to require companies to start reporting their greenhouse gas emissions in the US. And it's also not just how much companies are emitting, but also how might climate change and things like severe weather impact that business. So it's kind of a a two-way back and forth. So disclosures typically take a climate first approach. So we're prioritizing the things like greenhouse gas reporting and climate risks as a bare minimum. But of course, there's a lot of other topics under the sustainability umbrella. So things like biodiversity, water use, those are not excluded, but we're definitely prioritizing greenhouse gas emissions. And the point of disclosure legislation is to really drive transparency in your operation. So it allows investors and customers to decide if and how much they want to invest in your company if they think you're being a responsible corporate citizen. And it also helps to reduce greenwashing. So in the US, we're really following, we're not really leading in this space. There's a global trend, you could say, and over the past 2 decades, a number of different frameworks have been developed to help companies report, and depending on what industry you're in or what country you're in, you might follow a different framework, but a lot of it covers the same information. And so there's now what we're seeing is a lot of these frameworks are being consolidated into the ISSB, or International Sustainability Standards Board framework. And that hopefully will reduce reporting on some of these big companies, but it's just following that larger trend that makes it easier for companies to adopt a single framework rather than having multiple different reporting avenues. So about disclosure legislation, what does it actually require, and where are we seeing it in the US? So in a historic first for the United States, the SEC decided to adopt sustainability disclosure standards for publicly traded companies in Q1 of 2024. This legislation would require businesses of a certain size, and if they're publicly traded on the stock market, to report their Scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions, their climate-related risks, and also mitigation and adaptation strategies. So unfortunately, this legislation is actually currently paused due to several pieces of litigation against it. Some people say that the SEC has no authority to require companies to report this information. Other lawsuits say this legislation didn't go far enough in protecting our environment because they didn't require Scope 3 reporting. So it is currently paused, but I did want to mention it because it's just such a historic moment. That being said, even though the federal level legislation is paused, California passed similar legislation in 2023. So this is still a pretty broad applicability. I think it's 5,000 to 6,000 companies doing business in California. The thing with California's legislation is they did require Scope 3 emissions reporting. And so this is going to have impacts to those companies' supply chain. So even if you're not technically required under the legislation, if you supply to one of these companies, you may be getting asked questions about your performance. So the California is starting to report next year using data from this year. So over the next few years, this kind of information will be trickling down the supply chain. Given the state of the federal take on climate change and greenhouse gas reporting, it's not looking strong. That being said, a number of states have signed on. There's a great program called America All In. There's many states that are still really invested in climate action and passing climate action policy. So we are not likely to see federal level legislation, but definitely state by state, several states are looking at bills similar to California's. In general, sustainability disclosure is a type of climate action policy. So here's a fun heat map for each of those categories that I talked about. I'm going to show you a heat map, but here are some of the states that in the darkest blue have the most climate policies passed, and into the light blue is the fewest. Climate policy could be disclosures. It could also be establishing green banks and investment funds. It could be environmental justice. It could be state action plans. So climate policy really could mean a lot of different things, including disclosures. All right, the next category is extended producer responsibility. What is EPR? So EPR laws assign producers or manufacturers responsibility for the end of life of products that they manufacture. EPR laws typically cover common types of products as well as packaging. So you're going to see a lot of EPR laws focused on batteries, single-use plastics, car tires, electrical devices. So definitely there's certain industries that are high focuses for these pieces of legislation. What this legislation does is it basically requires these producers to establish industry organizations, and these are called producer responsibility organizations, or PROs, to implement these end-of-life management programs. About the legislation. So EPR laws address the financial and environmental burdens of waste management. So as we said before, manufacturers, just for profit, manufacture products, sell them, and sell as many as they can because that's how the economy works. And too often, cities and taxpayers are left with the financial burden as well as the environmental burden of managing this waste, sorting the waste, recycling it, storing it in landfills, and also, there could be pollution or leaching from these products. And it's also just a volume issue. We talk about plastics. There's so much plastics, and plastic producers are going to continue to create more and more and more volume. And so it's really time that we drive accountability back up the supply chain. And that's the intent of these laws. So the producer responsibility organizations, their job under this legislation is to study, report on, fund research, and develop processes to increase recyclability of their products, as well as manage proper disposal or better disposal. So this might look like take back schemes. It could look like rolling out educational programs, and it could also look like designing better products that are more intended to be recycled or more easily repaired. Great. Just had to check the chat real quick. So in 2024, California, Illinois, Maryland, Minnesota, and New Jersey passed extended producer responsibility laws. These EPR laws, they go back decades, but in 2024, these are the states that passed new laws. So some of those examples would be the Responsible Textile Act of 2024 in California. This is actually a first of its kind, starting to address textiles and the large, we hear all about fast fashion and we see piles of clothes everywhere. So this legislation is intended to start addressing that. And it would establish free, accessible, convenient drop-off or collection systems for covered apparel. I have swimwear here. There's literally 50 things on that list. Swimwear, workout clothes, like hoodies, t-shirts, certain baby products, baby clothes, there's a lot of different applicable categories of apparel covered under that program. Then we have the paint care program in Maryland that was passed. So this is a recycling program for paint. So if you have leftover paint, you can bring it to these collection sites, and that management disposal would be funded by the paint producers. And there's also a surcharge of a few cents on new paint to help fund that program. Then we have the Packaging Waste and Cost Reduction Act. So this is another big one, starting to look at packaging. In Minnesota, by 2032, all packaging sold in the state must be either recyclable, compostable, or reusable. So this mandates that producers cover 50% of recycling costs by 2029, scaling up to 90% by 2031. So really this means this is plastics. This is a plastics reduction law. If you're wondering where your state stands in regards to different product stewardship programs, this is a great resource, the Product Stewardship Institute. And again, here's another heat map. You can see states like California, Vermont, and Maine have the highest number of product stewardship or EPR laws. And then the ones in the gray have none at all. Last but certainly not least, PFAS. Most everyone I think would have heard about PFAS, but if you haven't, PFAS stands for per or polyfluorinated alkyls. So PFAS are basically forever chemicals that don't break down in the environment and are known health hazards, causing cancers and other serious ailments in humans and in animals that live in water or that we consume or consume other animals that live in water. So PFAS are extremely ubiquitous in consumer products. They do have a lot of applications that we are used to these days. They're really big, and that started with Teflon and nonstick cookware, and that other stain resistant type products in your rain gear, also in firefighting foam, plastics, pesticides, paints. Certain packaging has PFAS in them, so they're really used in a lot of different products. They're very small molecules, and so they get into our water through wastewater from manufacturing processes, or even just absorbed through the body through interaction with these various products. And because of their size, they're extremely difficult to filter out of water. And yeah, there's not, they've sampled water all over the world now, and PFAS just perpetuates itself through the water cycle. Really, it's a really big issue, a hot topic these days. So PFAS legislation cover a variety of different legislative regulation pathways. So for example, facilities that have worked with PFAS may now be required to disclose one-time reports about their use of PFAS. It could mean setting stricter limits for PFAS in water sources, and also disclosure requirements, like cities may be required to test and disclose if there's PFAS in water sources. Legislation could also be outright bans of PFAS in products like food packaging, beauty products, firefighting material. Firefighting is a big one that we're seeing. Also, legislation for PFAS could be environmental justice wins. So communities that are disproportionately affected by PFAS near manufacturing plants or low income, what have you, they're getting appropriations funding to help remedy some of that. In 2024, we saw a lot of movement and a lot of adoption of PFAS. So 155 bills were adopted across 29 states. So it's not just PFAS, there's other toxic chemicals included in that, but it's mostly PFAS. I'm not going to read the whole list, but it's really great to see such quick movement on such a concerning issue. So one example out of New Hampshire, HB or House Bill 1649 restricts PFAS chemicals in certain products, including carpets or rugs, cosmetics, textile treatments, feminine hygiene products, food packaging and containers, juvenile products, upholstered furniture, and textile furnishing. So this is an example of a PFAS ban type of legislation. If you want to know more, you can go to the Safer States website, but here's a heat map of what states have introduced and or adopted legislation in this space. All right, so that covers the three main hot topics for last year. Some of the honorable mentions, though, that may not be compliance issues, but states are definitely still making moves. So there's utility regulations, clean energy goals. States are passing, decarbonization step downs over the next decade or two. We also saw state climate action plans, so not just clean energy goals, but other things like EVs and things like that. Also, this one grabbed a few headlines last year, making polluters pay. So New York State will fine fossil fuel companies a total of 75 billion over the next 25 years to pay for damage caused to the climate. And this is, of course, related to greenhouse gas emissions. My home state of Maryland, we actually have similar legislation under consideration called the Renew Act. And I believe it was 9 billion in fines that these fossil fuel companies would have to pay. That is not passed yet, but we hope to see that go through this year. Also, environmental justice through the IRA, the Biden-Harris administration passed 1.5 billion plus dollars in environmental justice and climate justice community grants. So this is less of a legislation, but your community may be taking action to install air quality monitors, upgrade wastewater treatment plants, even trash incineration. I mean, there's a lot that this covers. And, we're not really allowed to say environmental justice anymore. If you search for that on government websites, you're not going to see a lot of it. But it's still out there and it is trickling down. So that being said, we're in the new year. State legislative sessions are happening now. And if you're interested in this, I would encourage you to get involved locally and see what your state is looking at in these spaces. For myself in Maryland, we have the Chesapeake Climate Action Network as well as the Sierra Club. Those are two groups that I follow to stay up on legislation happening in Maryland. So in conclusion, what does this mean for your business? So environmental sustainability legislation comes in many different forms. It's not just about greenhouse gas reporting. That being said, disclosures are moving in general from more voluntary to mandatory. So especially if you're a supplier, you may be getting more requests on your environmental sustainability performance from some of your customers. If you are a producer or importer of certain products, you need to be vigilant, especially in this kind of fractionated state by state approach, depending on where your facilities are located or where you're importing from. And the legislation may address raw materials or product design, take back programs, public education. I mean, you really have to know what the state you're doing business is passing so you can remain in compliance. And lastly, with PFAS, I mean, it's clean water is a human right. We all have a right to know if our water is clean, and we all have a right to hold businesses accountable that are using these toxic and hazardous chemicals, and they should be not using them, or at least paying to help clean them up. So that's something that we all deserve. So how can sustainability solutions help? Well, it's my job to help you stand out through sustainability. If you have facilities in different states, I can help with state-by-state legislation assessments. I can help with strategy development. I also offer other things, just educational sessions, speaking events, funding assessments, either through grants or even just like energy efficiency, tax credits, things like that. There's a lot of money out there to help businesses be more responsible. You can email me at hannah@sustainabilitysolutions.com. Check out the website, and also I encourage you to sign up for the newsletter. I publish one monthly, and it's got all kinds of fun stuff in there. So my references for today were the Climate Policy Dashboard, the Building Code Dashboard, Extended Producer Responsibility, the Product Stewardship Institute, as well as the Sustainable Packaging Coalition websites, and also PFAS, so saferstates.org. Thank you very much. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day. If there's any questions, you can put them in the chat now and we'll get to them. Thanks.